December 15th, 1944. The Western Front is a frozen landscape of misery. For months, Allied soldiers have been pushing relentlessly across Europe, and now, huddled in icy foxholes, scattered across Belgium and Luxembourg, a sense of weary optimism hangs in the air. The war, they believe, is almost over. Christmas is just around the corner, and with it, the hope of going home. The dense, ancient Ardennes Forest is covered in a thick blanket of snow. It's silenced, both beautiful and eerie. It's a sector considered quiet, a place for green American troops to get their first taste of the front lines, or for weary veterans to rest and refit. No one expects a major fight here, certainly not in the dead of winter. The prevailing thought in the Allied High Command is that the German army is broken, on the verge of total collapse. They are wrong. Deadly wrong. In the pre-dawn darkness, that eerie silence is shattered. A deafening, terrifying roar rips through the freezing air as thousands of German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The forest, a moment ago a picture of winter stillness, erupts in a storm of fire and steel. Trees splinter and explode. The ground shakes violently, and the sky is lit by the flashes of countless explosions. It's a bombardment of unimaginable intensity, designed to sow chaos, cut communication lines, and soften up the shocked and unprepared American positions. For the soldiers in their foxholes, it's a living nightmare. The world has turned into a whirlwind of noise, dirt, and death. Before they can even begin to comprehend what's happening, a new sound joins the cacophony. The rumble of engines. Through the thick, disorienting fog and the swirling snow, ghostly shapes begin to emerge from the tree line. Tanks, hundreds of them, the dreaded German panzers, including the formidable new King Tigers, spearhead a massive infantry assault. Over 200,000 German soldiers, a force the Allies thought no longer existed, surge forward with a desperate ferocity. They pour through the gaps in the thinly held American lines, their white winter camouflage making them phantoms in the blizzard. The American divisions holding this sector, like the 106th and the 28th Infantry, are stretched thin over a massive front. They are outnumbered, outgunned, and completely surprised. The initial attack is a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Units are cut off, command posts are overrun, and communication breaks down almost immediately. Small pockets of soldiers find themselves surrounded, fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. This isn't a small this is a full-blown offensive. This massive, audacious assault is the beginning of what will become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It is Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West, codenamed Watchterm Rainwatch on the Rhine. The plan is breathtakingly ambitious. The goal is to punch through the Allied lines, race to the Meuse River, and then swing north to capture the vital port city of Antwerp. By cutting off the British and Canadian armies from the American forces to the south, Hitler hopes to force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace, allowing him to turn Germany's full military might against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. It's a desperate plan, born from a mind increasingly detached from reality, but it is executed with shocking power and precision in its opening hours. The element of surprise is total. Allied intelligence had failed spectacularly, dismissing warnings and underestimating the enemy's capacity to launch such a large-scale operation. The German commanders leading the charge, like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and the aggressive Hasso von Manteuffel, have assembled three powerful armies for this push. They've stripped other fronts and gathered their last reserves of fuel, ammunition, and elite armored divisions. For the young German soldiers, many of them barely teenagers, this is a final, fanatical effort to save their homeland. They are well equipped and highly motivated, a stark contrast to the complacent mood that had settled over their Allied counterparts. As the first day of the offensive unfolds, the German tide seems unstoppable. They tear a massive hole in the American front, creating the famous bulge in the Allied lines that gives the battle its name. Towns like Clavaux and Vith and Wiltz become scenes of desperate fighting as isolated American units try to stem the tide. The situation is dire. The American High Command is in a state of shock, scrambling to understand the scale of the disaster and to rush reinforcements to the crumbling front. Among the German spearheads is a particularly infamous unit led by the notorious SS officer Joachim Peiper. His Kampfgruppe Peiper, an armored battle group from the 1st SS Panzer Division, is tasked with the deepest penetration, a lightning-fast drive to seize bridges over the Meuse River. Peiper's column leaves a trail of destruction in its wake, characterized by a ruthless disregard for the rules of war. This brutality will culminate in one of the most infamous atrocities of the battle, the Montmartre massacre, where over 80 American prisoners of war are gunned down in a field. The news of this war crime will spread like wildfire among the Allied troops, hardening their resolve and turning a desperate defense into a bitter, vengeful fight to the death. There would be no surrender. But the German plan, for all its initial success, has critical flaws. It relies on speed, surprise, and a continuous, rapid advance. It also heavily depends on capturing Allied fuel dumps to keep the thirsty panzers moving, a strategy the Germans called frank und frei, or open and free raiding. And crucially, the plan depends on the bad weather continuing. The thick fog and low clouds that have grounded the all-powerful Allied air forces are the German army's greatest ally. If the skies clear, the panzers and infantry columns will become easy targets for American and British fighter bombers. The entire operation is a race against time, a roll of the dice where everything must go perfectly for the Germans to succeed. As the first day draws to a close on December 16th, the scale of the German success is stunning. They have achieved a complete tactical surprise and are advancing on a broad front. But already, signs of trouble are emerging. The American soldiers, though initially overwhelmed, are not breaking. They are fighting back with incredible courage. Small groups of engineers, artillerymen, and infantrymen are forming makeshift roadblocks, blowing bridges, and holding crucial crossroads for as long as possible. Every hour of delay they buy is an hour gained for the Allied command to react. Small, seemingly insignificant Belgian towns are about to become the sites of legendary stands. Places like St. Vith, and most famously, the vital road junction of Bastogne, are about to enter the annals of military history. The German timetable is already starting to slip. The Bulge has been created, but the shoulders of the penetration are holding firm, threatening to choke off the German advance. Hitler's final gamble has been unleashed in a storm of fire and fury, but the response from the outnumbered, surrounded, and freezing American GIs will determine the fate of the war in Europe. The fight for the Ardennes has only just begun. December 16th, 1944. A date etched in the frozen soil of the Ardennes Forest. For months, the Allied war machine had been grinding relentlessly eastward, pushing the German army back to its own borders. From the sunny beaches of Normandy to the cobblestone streets of Paris, victory seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The mood was optimistic. Many soldiers believed they'd be home for Christmas. But in the deep, cold heart of Berlin, a different plan was taking shape. Deep within his bunker, Adolf Hitler was preparing his final, desperate gamble. The war on the Eastern Front was a catastrophe. His cities were being bombed into rubble day and night, and the Allied armies were now knocking on Germany's door. For a man who had once commanded the most powerful military force in Europe, defeat was unthinkable. And so, he conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity, a strike so powerful it would shatter the Allied coalition and turn the tide of the war. He called it Operation Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. The name was a deception, suggesting a defensive posture. The reality was anything but. The objective was audacious. A massive armored thrust would punch through the weakest point in the Allied lines. The dense, supposedly impassable Ardennes Forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. This was the same corridor Germany had used to stun the French and British in 1940. Hitler was betting that lightning could strike twice. On Hugues panzer armies would race northwest, cross the Meuse River, and seize the critical port of Antwerp. This would cut the Allied forces in two, stranding the British and Canadian armies in the north and starving them of supplies. Hitler believed that this catastrophic defeat would force the Western Allies to sue for a separate peace, allowing him to turn his full might against the Soviet Union. It was a grand vision, the last roll of the dice for the Third Reich. To fuel this desperate offensive, Hitler scraped together the last reserves of German military power. Elite panzer divisions, some newly equipped, others pulled from the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, were secretly assembled. Among them were the fearsome Tiger II tanks, behemoths of steel nearly impervious to Allied anti-tank weapons. Supporting them were thousands of Volksgrenadier, Trupse, mix of hardened veterans, young boys, and old men, and the fanatical Waffen-SS, notorious for their brutality and unwavering loyalty. Over 250,000 soldiers and more than 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles gathered in the forests, a ghost army waiting for the signal to attack. The secrecy was absolute. Orders were delivered by hand. Radio silence was strictly enforced, and troop movements were conducted only under the cover of darkness. The Allies, lulled into a false sense of security, were completely unaware. Their intelligence reports suggested Germany was on the brink of collapse, incapable of launching any major offensive action. The Ardennes sector was considered a quiet zone, a place for new divisions to get accustomed to the front line or for weary units to rest and refit. The American troops stationed there, like the 106th Infantry Division, were largely green and untested. They were thinly spread, holding a long line through the rugged snow-covered terrain. Adding to the Allied blindness was the weather. A thick, persistent fog and low-lying clouds blanketed the region. Dies Wetter, which the Germans called weather, was perfect for the attackers. It grounded the Allies' single greatest advantage: their total air supremacy. The powerful P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, which had terrorized German columns all summer and fall, were stuck on their airfields in England and France, their pilots staring helplessly at the impenetrable gray sky. The eyes of the Allied army were blind. Then, at 5:30 a.m., on December 16th, the quiet was shattered. A storm of fire erupted along the 85-mile front as 2,000 German artillery pieces opened up. The ground shook, and the sky lit up with explosions. Shells rained down on the American positions, severing communication lines, destroying command posts, and plunging the frontline units into chaos and confusion. Before the dazed defenders could even comprehend what was happening, the German assault began. Waves of infantry and steel pushed forward through the snow and mist. The initial shock was devastating. The German attack hit the weakest points of the American line with overwhelming force. Panzer divisions, led by the infamous SS officer Joachim Peiper, smashed through the thinly held defenses. 2 regiments of the 106th Infantry Division were quickly surrounded and forced to surrender in one of the largest mass surrenders of U.S. troops in the war. The German advance seemed unstoppable. It created a massive bulge in the Allied lines, a bulge that would give the battle its famous name. For a moment, a terrifying, fleeting moment, Hitler's plan seemed to be working. The Allies were in disarray, their commanders struggling to get a clear picture of the disaster unfolding. Panic began to ripple through the rear echelons. It was the largest German offensive in the West since 1940, and it had caught everyone completely by surprise. Everyone, that is, except for one man. Far from the chaos of the front lines, at his headquarters in Versailles, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, received the fragmented and alarming reports, while many of his subordinates were panicking, seeing only a massive, potentially catastrophic setback. Eisenhower saw something different. He recognized the sheer scale of the German commitment. He understood that Hitler had thrown everything he had left into this one attack. It was not a feint or a spoiling attack. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. And in that gamble, Eisenhower saw not a disaster, but an opportunity to destroy the last remnants of the German army in the West. He famously told his staff, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this headquarters." While the German spearheads pushed deeper into the Ardennes, Eisenhower acted with decisive calm. He began to orchestrate a massive countermove, treating the German bulge not as a breach to be plugged, but as a sack to be tied off and annihilated. He immediately ordered 2 veteran airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, to be trucked to the front to shore up the collapsing line. More importantly, he looked to the south, to the battle-hardened Third Army and its brilliant, aggressive, and controversial commander. He needed a miracle, a commander who could pivot his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and launch a massive counterattack against the German flank. He needed General George S. Patton. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is often told as a story of German surprise and American desperation. It's the story of the heroic defense of Bastogne, of the massacre at Malmedy, and of the bitter, frozen fighting in the forests. But it is also a story of high command, of strategic vision versus strategic reality. Hitler's vision was born of fantasy and delusion, a plan that looked brilliant on a map but ignored the logistical realities and the immense industrial and military power of the Allies. Eisenhower's vision was pragmatic and ruthless. He saw his opponent's final, desperate move and prepared to meet it not with defense, but with a crushing counteroffensive. The stage was set for one of the largest and bloodiest battles of World War II, a showdown that would determine the final fate of the Third Reich. December 17, 1944. A cold, thick fog blankets the Ardennes Forest. For the Allied High Command, this day would mark the beginning of a nightmare. The German war machine, thought to be on its last legs, had just launched a massive, surprise offensive. This was the opening salvo of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Initial reports were confusing, a trickle of disjointed messages that hinted at something terrible. Communications lines were being cut. Radio signals vanished into the ether. Entire American units, thinly spread across the supposedly quiet sector, were disappearing from the map, swallowed by the German advance and the swirling snowstorm. The situation was escalating with terrifying speed. Allied headquarters was flooded with panicked reports. Roads were becoming hopelessly jammed with retreating troops and terrified civilians, creating a chaotic bottleneck that stalled reinforcements and supplies. It was a perfect storm of confusion and fear. The Germans were exploiting the element of surprise with ruthless efficiency, their armored columns punching deep into the Allied lines. The front, which had seemed so stable just hours before, was now in danger of complete collapse. Amid this growing crisis, one small town in Belgium began to take on immense strategic importance. It wasn't a fortress or a major city, but a humble crossroads town. Yet, its location was critical. 7 major roads converged there, making it the key to controlling movement throughout the entire region. For the Allies, holding Bastogne meant they could slow the German advance, funnel in reinforcements, and prevent their armies from being split in two. If Bastogne fell, the German panzers would have a clear path to the Meuse River and beyond, potentially encircling hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers and changing the entire course of the war in the West. Bastogne had to be held at all costs. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a grim reality. His forces were reeling. The German onslaught was more powerful and coordinated than anyone had anticipated. He needed to plug the gap, and he needed to do it immediately. The 101st Airborne Division was already being rushed towards Bastogne, a desperate gamble to get there before the Germans. But even that might not be enough. Eisenhower needed more than a defensive plug. He needed a counterpunch. He needed a commander who could move with lightning speed, who thrived in chaos, and who possessed an almost manic audacity. In a high-stakes meeting at his headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower and his top generals assessed the dire situation. The mood was somber. Plans were being torn up. Strategies They needed someone who could not only stop the bleeding but turn the tide. As the discussion intensified, one name kept coming up, a commander known for his speed, his aggressive tactics, and his sheer, unpredictable force of will. A man who was currently on the sidelines, his Third Army engaged further south, but who was infamous for his ability to achieve the impossible. The call went out. It was a summons for General George S. Patton. Jr. Patton was a controversial figure, as famous for his fiery personality and pearl-handled pistols as he was for his battlefield genius. He was the master of mobile warfare, the one commander the Germans truly feared. His Third Army was already engaged in heavy fighting, but Eisenhower needed his best man for this job. The task was monumental, almost unthinkable. Disengage his entire army from its current front, pivot 90 degrees, and march over 100 miles north through treacherous winter conditions to hit the German flank and relieve the besieged defenders of Bastogne. For any other commander, it would have been an order to be debated, planned, and meticulously organized over weeks. For Patton, it was a challenge he was born for. He had been sensing for days that something was brewing, that the Germans were not yet beaten. He had already, on his own initiative, begun wargaming potential responses to a German attack in the Ardennes. When the official call came, he wasn't just ready. Was eager. This was the kind of high-stakes, dramatic battle that defined his career. The pressure was immense. The fate of the entire Western Front, and perhaps the war itself, now rested on the shoulders of the defenders of a small Belgian town, and the audacious general racing to their rescue. The German plan depended on speed, aiming to capture Bastogne within the first few days. The Allied response depended on a different kind of speed, the relentless, driving force of Patton's Third Army. Two colossal forces were now on a collision course, with Bastogne as the epicenter. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, were already on their way, packed into trucks and racing through the night towards the beleaguered town. They knew they were heading into a storm, but they had no idea they were about to be completely surrounded, cut off from the rest of the world. Their fight for survival in the frozen landscape of Bastogne would become a legend. They were the anvil, and far to the south, the hammer was beginning to swing. Patton gathered his staff, his eyes blazing with intensity. He gave them their orders, a simple and direct command that would set in motion one of the most incredible logistical and military feats in history. The race to save Bastogne had begun. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is a story of incredible courage against impossible odds. It is a testament to the resilience of the soldiers who fought in the bitter cold and the bold leadership that turned a potential catastrophe into a decisive victory. What happened next in the snow-covered forests around Bastogne would cement the legends of both the 101st Airborne and General Patton, forever changing the history of World War II. Picture this. December 19th, 1944. A cold winter grips Luxembourg, but the real storm is brewing on the battlefield. Inside his headquarters, General George S. Patton receives a message that makes the blood of other commanders run cold. The Germans have launched a massive, surprise, counteroffensive through the Ardennes Forest. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. While panic ripples through the Allied command, Patton remains eerily calm. He listens to the report, and then a slow smile spreads across his face. This wasn't a surprise to him. It was an opportunity he had been waiting for. He had not only anticipated this move, he had practically willed it to happen. For weeks, Patton had been a man possessed. He drove his staff, the Third Army's brain trust, to the brink. While other armies focused on their own fronts, Patton insisted they prepare for the impossible. What if the Germans break through here? He demanded, stabbing a finger at a map of the Ardennes. He ordered them to create not one, not two, but three distinct, detailed plans for a massive a pivot north that most considered a logistical fantasy. His staff, led by the brilliant Hobart Hopgay, thought he was obsessed, perhaps even losing his grip. They worked tirelessly, drafting complex troop movements, supply chains, and artillery deployments for a battle that didn't exist. It seemed like a monumental waste of time and energy, all to satisfy the whim of their eccentric commander. But they did it, because that's what you did when you worked for Patton. You followed orders, no matter how crazy they seemed. Now, as the news of the German breakthrough confirmed Patton's premonition, the value of that crazy preparation became shatteringly clear. The German spearhead was punching deep into the American lines, aiming to split the Allied forces and seize the vital port of Antwerp. At the 101st Airborne's position in Bastogne, a crucial crossroads, the situation was becoming desperate. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on everything. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, known as Ike, urgently summoned his top generals to a crisis meeting in Verdun, France. The atmosphere in the underground bunker was heavy with tension. The question on everyone's mind was simple. How do we stop this German juggernaut? One by one, the generals reported, their armies were entrenched, engaged in their own battles. To disengage, turn their entire force 90 degrees, and march north through the frozen winter landscape was a Herculean task. The consensus was grim. Most commanders, including the highly respected Omar Bradley, stated they would need at least a week, maybe 10 days, to get their forces moving toward Bastogne. A week the defenders of Bastogne simply did not have. Then, it was Patton's turn. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the flamboyant general, known for his pearl-handled pistols and profane speeches. He strode confidently to the massive map of Europe that dominated the room. He didn't hesitate. He didn't consult his notes. He simply planted his feet, pointed a finger directly at the German bulge on the map, and declared in a voice that cut through the gloom, "I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. A stunned silence filled the bunker. 48 hours? It was impossible. Madness. It meant disengaging from an active front, turning an entire army of over 200,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles, and marching them over 100 miles on icy roads in the dead of winter straight into the teeth of a German assault. It was the kind of audacious, reckless pronouncement they had come to expect from Patton. But this time it wasn't just bravado, it was a promise, backed by weeks of relentless, obsessive planning. The 3 plans his staff had cursed him for were now the keys to saving the Allied front. When Eisenhower, skeptical but desperate, asked which direction he would attack from, Patton simply replied, "I've already made the arrangements." He was ready. Eisenhower, recognizing the unique blend of foresight and audacity before him, gave the order. The fate of the battle, and perhaps the war in Europe, now rested on Patton's seemingly impossible timeline. Immediately, the gears of the Third Army began to turn with incredible speed. The pre-drafted orders flew out. Divisions that were fighting one enemy 1 hour were on the road marching north the next. It was a symphony of controlled chaos, a logistical ballet on an epic scale. Imagine the scene. Endless columns of tanks, trucks, and soldiers, their breath fogging in the frigid air, churning through the snow-covered roads of France and Luxembourg. A river of steel and manpower flowing north. The Third Army's pivot was one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in history. They moved faster than the Germans, or even their own allies, thought possible, and just as promised, within 48 hours, elements of Patton's Third Army were engaging the southern flank of the German offensive. On December 26th, the 4th Armored Division, the tip of Patton's spear, broke through the German lines and relieved the battered but unbroken defenders of Bastogne. The iconic message from the German commander demanding surrender had been met with the legendary one-word reply from the 101st S acting commander, General McAuliffe. Nuts. Patton's arrival made good on that defiance. Patton's madness was, in fact, strategic genius. It was the ability to see not just the current battlefield, but to anticipate the enemy's next move and prepare for it with obsessive detail. His decisive action at the Verdun Conference and the Third Army's incredible rapid deployment didn't just relieve Bastogne, it stabilized the entire Allied line and turned the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. It was the moment that solidified his legend as old blood and guts, a general who didn't just fight battles, but who could bend the very flow of war to his will. It was a testament to the idea that in the darkest moments of crises, sometimes what you need isn't caution, but calculated, audacious, and brilliantly prepared madness. Ever heard of a miracle happening in just 72 hours? Not a biblical one, but a military miracle. One that unfolded in the bone-chilling winter of 1944. This is the story of how General George S. Patton and his Third Army achieved the impossible. It's December 20th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge is raging. American forces in the Ardennes are surrounded, desperate, and on the brink of collapse. The situation looks grim. The German offensive has caught the Allies completely by surprise, and the town of Bastogne, held by the 101st Airborne, is a key strategic point under siege. If it falls, the entire Allied front could crumble. Enter General Patton. While other commanders were still trying to grasp the scale of the German attack, Patton was already planning a counter-move. At a high-command meeting in Verdun, while others talked of retreat and containment, Patton made a promise that seemed insane. He claimed he could disengage his Third Army, which was currently facing south and preparing for a totally different offensive, turn it 90 degrees north, and attack the German flank to relieve Bastogne. When asked how long it would take, he replied, 48 hours. The room was stunned into silence. 48 hours to turn an entire army. It was unheard of. It defied every principle of military logistics. His superiors gave him a slightly more realistic deadline. 72 hours. The clock started ticking. So, what did this impossible pivot actually involve? Imagine trying to turn a giant, complex machine on a dime. We're talking about 6 entire divisions. That's over 250,000 soldiers, 50,000 vehicles, tanks, trucks, jeeps, and 70,000 tons of supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, medical equipment. All of it had to be rerouted, reorganized, and sent charging north. And this wasn't happening on a sunny day on a modern superhighway. This was December in the Ardennes. The region was being hammered by one of the worst winters in recent memory. Roads were solid sheets of ice, glazed over with fresh snow. Blizzards reduced visibility to near zero. Temperatures plummeted so low that engines would freeze solid if they weren't kept running constantly. The logistical nightmare was immense. Convoys of vehicles stretched 4 miles and miles, sometimes over 100 miles long, creating massive traffic jams on the narrow, icy roads. Military police worked around the clock, freezing at their posts, trying to direct this chaotic river of steel. They used colored lights to guide different divisions down different routes, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. Drivers were pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. They drove day and night, some teams for 36 hours straight with no sleep, their eyes burning from exhaustion and the glare of snow. They survived on sheer willpower and endless cups of coffee. If a truck broke down, it was simply pushed into a ditch to keep the line moving. There was no time for repairs. Every second counted. Fuel was another life or death problem. The army was a thirsty beast, and the supply lines were stretched thin. Fuel trucks were given absolute priority. Sometimes, soldiers had to form bucket brigades to refuel tanks and trucks manually in the freezing cold. Ammunition was just as critical. Artillery shells, machine gun belts, rifle cartridges, all had to reach the front lines. The weight was enormous, and every truck was loaded to its absolute limit. And let's not forget the men themselves. These soldiers were pulled from one fight and thrown directly into another, with barely a moment's rest. They traveled in open-top trucks, exposed to the biting wind and snow, huddled together for warmth. Frostbite was as much an enemy as the Germans, yet they endured. They knew their brothers in the 101st were surrounded and counting on them. This wasn't just an order from a general, it was a rescue mission. What Patton was demanding wasn't just speed, it was precision under chaos. In a war where logistics, getting the right stuff to the right place at the right time, were often more deadly than bullets, he was orchestrating a logistical symphony. He had been preparing for this moment his entire career. His staff, known as the Patton family, were some of the most brilliant logistical minds in the army. They had been trained by Patton to think on their feet, to improvise, and to never, ever say something was impossible. They had already drafted 3 different contingency plans for an attack north, just in case. When Patton gave the order, they weren't starting from scratch. They were activating a plan. The execution was breathtaking. The 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of the attack, covered over 150 miles in treacherous conditions. Think about that. Heavy tanks, sliding on ice, fighting for every inch of road, moving through a blizzard, all while preparing to slam into a powerful enemy force. It was a race against time, fought not just against the Germans, but against the weather, against exhaustion, and against the very laws of physics. As the Third Army thundered north, the besieged soldiers in Bastogne held on, famously replying nuts to a German demand for surrender. They were buying time, and they knew Patton was coming. The sound of his guns, getting closer and closer, was the most beautiful music they had ever heard. In just 72 hours, Patton's men were in position and attacking the German southern flank. The impossible had been achieved. This incredible feat of arms and logistics didn't just relieve Bastogne, it changed the entire momentum of the Battle of the Bulge. It plugged the hole in the Allied line and marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's last great gamble in the West. It's a testament to incredible leadership, brilliant staff work, and the sheer grit and determination of the American soldier. The 72-hour miracle of the Third Army remains one of the most astonishing operational achievements in all of military history. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes, with enough willpower and audacity, You really can make the impossible happen. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest is a landscape of snow, steel, and shadow. Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, is in full swing. Panzer divisions have smashed through the American lines, creating a massive salient, a bulge, in the Allied front. And at the very heart of this chaos, at a critical crossroads town named Bastogne, the American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, are completely surrounded. Imagine you're a paratrooper from the 101st. You were rushed here with little more than the rifle in your hands and the uniform on your back. You were supposed to be resting and refitting after the brutal fighting in Holland. Instead, you've been thrown into the meat grinder. German armor and infantry encircle your position. A tight, frozen perimeter around the town. You are outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from the rest of the world. The snow falls relentlessly, a thick white blanket that muffles sound and chills you to the bone. The temperature plummets, freezing weapons, numbing fingers, and making every moment a struggle for survival. The German artillery is constant, the scream of incoming shells, the concussive blast that shakes the frozen earth. It's the soundtrack to your life in this frozen hell. You dig your foxhole deeper into the icy ground, huddling for warmth with your buddies, sharing whatever meager rations you have left. Ammunition is critically low. Every bullet counts. Medical supplies are almost gone. The wounded are treated in makeshift aid stations, their suffering amplified by the bitter cold. The strategic importance of Bastogne is immense. It's a hub of 7 major roads, and as long as the Americans hold it, the German advance is crippled. They can't effectively supply their panzer spearheads pushing west. The fate of the entire Battle of the Bulge hinges on this one small Belgian town. The German command knows this. They are confident. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers, carrying a white flag of truce, approach the American lines. They deliver a formal demand for surrender to the acting commander of the 101st, Brigadier General Anthony Mac. The message is typed, arrogant, and clear. Surrender honorably within 2 hours, or face total annihilation. The alternative, it states, is the complete destruction of Bastogne and its defenders. McAuliffe reads the ultimatum. His staff officers discuss the impossible situation they're in. Surrender seems like the only logical option to save the lives of his men. But these are the men of the 101st Airborne. They don't do logical when it means quitting. McAuliffe, initially bewildered by the sheer audacity of the demand, scoffs at the idea. When asked what his official reply should be, a single, perfect word comes to mind. It's a piece of classic American slang, a defiant, dismissive, and utterly unambiguous rejection of the entire proposition. He dictates the official response. It is typed up and handed back to the German emissaries. The note contains just one word: nuts. The German officer who receives the reply is confused. He asks, "Is that a negative or an affirmative?" The American officer delivering the message, Colonel Joseph Harper, clarifies for him. "If you don't understand what nuts means," he says, "in plain English, it is the same as go to hell." The message is sent. The line has been drawn in the snow. There will be no surrender. For the soldiers in the foxholes, the news spreads like wildfire. Nuts. It becomes their rallying cry, a symbol of their unbreakable spirit. It's a joke shared in the face of death, a defiant roar against the overwhelming odds. It boosts morale in a way no formal speech ever could. Now, they know they are in it to the end. Every man on the line, from the highest-ranking officer to the lowest private, understands the stakes. They will hold Bastogne, or die trying. The Germans, enraged by the response, unleash a furious new wave of attacks. The fighting intensifies, becoming even more brutal and personal. It's close-quarters combat in the woods and fields surrounding the town, a desperate struggle for every inch of frozen ground. As Christmas approaches, the situation grows more dire. Food is almost gone. Men are surviving on scraps. Ammunition is down to the last few rounds per soldier. The fog and heavy snow that have grounded the Allied air forces persist, a gray, oppressive ceiling that traps them in their siege. But then, on December 23rd, a miracle happens. The sky's clear. The sun breaks through the clouds. For the first time in days, the men in Bastogne can see the brilliant blue sky, and with that clear sky comes the roar of engines. Not German engines this time. American engines. A fleet of C-47 transport planes appears overhead. A beautiful, welcome sight. Parachutes blossom in the sky, not with men, but with brightly colored canisters. It's the cavalry from the clouds. These airdrops bring everything the defenders have been praying for. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, and mail from home. The sight of those planes, the tangible proof that they haven't been forgotten, reinvigorates the exhausted soldiers. They now have the means to keep fighting. The airdrops are not without risk. The planes fly low and slow, facing intense German anti-aircraft fire. But they get the job done. The lifeline is reestablished. The airdrops give the 101st the bullets and bandages they need. But they can't break the siege. Only one thing can do that. Ground reinforcements, and every soldier in Bastogne knows who is coming. They put their faith in one man. A general as tenacious and profane as they were. General George S. Patton. Miles to the south, Patton's Third Army is performing one of the most incredible logistical feats of the war. On hearing of the crisis in the Ardennes, Patton had famously promised he could turn his entire army, which was facing east 90 degrees north, and attack the German flank to relieve Bastogne within 48 hours. His staff thought he was insane. It was a monumental undertaking, moving over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles through icy roads in the dead of winter, straight into a major battle. But Patton was a man of his word. The Third Army disengaged from its current fight, pivoted, and began a relentless high-speed march north. Leading the charge was the 4th Armored Division. They were the spearhead, the breakthrough division, tasked with smashing through the German ring around Bastogne. The tankers and infantrymen of the 4th Armored fought their way north, battling through German resistance, treacherous roads, and the crippling cold. For them, Bastogne was more than a strategic objective. It was a rescue mission. Back in the perimeter, the men of the 101st could hear the distant rumble of the fighting. They knew Patton was close. It was a race against time. The Germans launched one final, massive assault on Christmas Day, hoping to crush the defenders before Patton could arrive. The fighting was savage, but the freshly resupplied paratroopers held their ground, throwing back every attack with newfound ferocity. Then, on the day after Christmas, December 26th, the tankers of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion finally broke through. The lead Sherman tank, named Cobra King, crashed through the German lines and linked up with the beleaguered defenders of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. The paratroopers who had held the line against impossible odds were finally relieved. The defense of Bastogne was a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. The raw courage of the outnumbered Screaming Eagles, symbolized by that one-word reply. Nats had stalled the German advance at a critical juncture. It had bought the Allies precious time to regroup and launch a It showed the world the incredible resilience of the American soldier. The story of Bastogne is not just about strategy or tactics. It's about human endurance, defiance in the face of annihilation, and the unbreakable bond between soldiers who refuse to let each other down. It remains one of the most heroic chapters in the history of the United States Army. It's Christmas Day, 1944. For the American soldiers of the 101st Airborne, trapped in the Belgian town of Bastogne, it's anything but merry. They are surrounded, outnumbered, and running dangerously low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The weather is their enemy, a thick, suffocating fog that has kept Allied air support grounded for days. The German siege tightens its grip, and the constant shelling is a brutal reminder of their grim reality. Hope is a currency in even shorter supply than bullets. On this bleak Christmas morning, one man isn't praying for victory. He's praying for something much simpler. General George S. Patton, leading the Third Army in a desperate race to relieve Bastogne, looks up at the impenetrable gray sky. He had famously, or perhaps infamously, asked a chaplain to write a prayer for good weather. His prayer was direct. "Sir, this is Patton talking. You have seen me through all this war. I am asking you for one more favor. For 4 days I have been trying to smash the enemy. I need your help." I need 48 hours of clear weather. And on Christmas morning, a miracle happens. The snow stops falling. The dense fog that has shrouded the Ardennes for what felt like an eternity begins to dissipate. A fragile patch of blue appears. Then another. The sun, a long-absent friend, finally breaks through. For the men shivering in their foxholes, it's the most beautiful sight they've ever seen. The change is almost instantaneous. A new sound fills the air. A deep, resonant hum that grows into a deafening roar. It's the sound of salvation. First come the C-47 transport planes, a swarm of them, their fuselages packed with everything the defenders of Bastogne desperately need. Parachutes blossom across the sky, a belated Christmas miracle delivering crates of ammunition, rations, life-saving plasma, and mail from home. The sight invigorates the exhausted paratroopers. Their spirits, battered but not broken, soar. They finally have the means to keep fighting. But the sky brings more than just supplies. It brings vengeance. Following the transports are the fighters and bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and B-26 Marauders. Unleashed at last, they dive from the heavens like birds of prey, their machine guns and bombs tearing into the German positions that ring Bastogne. The tables have turned. The hunters have become the hunt. The German armored columns, previously able to operate with impunity under the cover of the fog, are now exposed and vulnerable. Allied pilots, eager for action after days of being grounded, make them pay a heavy price. The snow-covered fields around the town become a graveyard of twisted German steel. For the men of the 101st, the air is now filled with two distinct sounds. Above, the continuous roar of friendly aircraft, and in the distance, from the south, a new sound begins to emerge. It's a low, guttural rumble, a rhythmic, earth-shaking thunder that isn't from artillery. It's the sound of tank treads grinding against frozen earth. It's the sound of Patton's Third Army. 4 days, they had been fighting their way north through a frozen hell. They battled not only determined German resistance, but also the treacherous terrain and the biting cold. Every road was a potential ambush, every forest a hiding place for enemy anti-tank guns. Progress was measured in yards, paid for in blood and frozen steel. But they never stopped. Driven by Patton's relentless will, they pushed onward, day and night. Inside Bastogne, the men listen. They strain their ears, trying to distinguish the sound from the cacophony of battle. But it's unmistakable. It's getting louder, closer. The deep growl of Sherman tanks, the clatter of half-tracks, the unmistakable symphony of a modern army on the move. Each decibel is a dose of pure hope. It's the sound of the cavalry coming. Imagine being one of those soldiers. You've spent a week in a frozen foxhole, eating snow for water, sharing your last clips of ammunition. You've listened to German loudspeakers demanding your surrender, and you've heard your commander's now legendary one-word reply. Nuts. You've held the line against overwhelming odds, believing, praying that help would come. And now, you can hear it. It's not a rumor or a promise. It's a physical reality, a vibration you can feel in your chest. It's the sound of Patton's tanks churning through the snow-choked forests, mile by agonizing mile. They are out there. They are coming for you. The siege is about to be broken. This Christmas of 1944 was a turning point. It was the day the weather broke, the day the skies opened up, and the day the tide of the Battle of the Bulge truly began to turn. It was a testament to the resilience of the soldiers in Bastogne, the ferocity of the pilots in the air, and the unstoppable determination of the tankers on the ground. It was the day a prayer for clear skies was answered, unleashing the full might of the Allied war machine and bringing the promise of liberation, rumbling through the frozen woods of the Ardennes. The end of the siege was near, and with it, the beginning of the end for the German offensive. December 26, 1944. For the exhausted, frostbitten men of the 101st Airborne Division, huddled in their foxholes around the Belgian town of Bastogne, this would be a day they'd never forget. For 7 long days, they had been completely surrounded by a massive German force, outnumbered and outgunned. They were running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The winter was one of the coldest on record, and the gray, overcast skies seemed to mirror their grim situation. Yet, against all odds, they held the line. Their commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had famously replied to a German surrender demand with a single word. Nuts. It was a defiant roar that echoed the spirit of every single soldier in the 101st. They would not break. But defiance alone couldn't stop tank shells or feed a starving soldier. They needed a miracle, and that miracle had a name. General George S. Patton Jr., when the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, began. Patton was nearly 200 miles away. His Third Army was engaged in a completely different fight. When Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower asked him how long it would take to turn his entire army 90 degrees and race north to relieve the besieged paratroopers at Bastogne, the other generals said a week, maybe more. It was a logistical nightmare. 3 entire divisions, over 20,000 men and their thousands of vehicles, would have to disengage from one battle, pivot, and march over 100 miles on icy, treacherous roads in the dead of winter. It was considered impossible. Patton, in his characteristic fashion, stunned everyone. He looked Eisenhower in the eye and said he could do it in 48 hours. The room was silent. They thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. The moment he left that meeting, Patton unleashed the full force of his will. He got on the phone and began barking orders. The Third Army, a finely tuned machine built in Patton's own image, roared to life. Convoys started rolling day and night, a steel serpent winding its way through the frozen Belgian countryside. The men were pushed to their absolute limits. They drove without sleep, grabbing food on the move, their trucks skidding on icy patches. Engineers worked frantically to clear roads and build bridges, sometimes under enemy fire. The weather was their relentless enemy. Snow, sleet, and freezing fog made progress agonizingly slow, but they kept moving. Patton was everywhere, a whirlwind of energy, driving his men forward with a mixture of profanity, praise, and sheer, indomitable presence. He even famously ordered a chaplain to write a prayer for good weather. The next day, the skies cleared, allowing Allied air power to finally join the fight. Bike in Bastogne, the 101st, was hanging on by a thread. The Germans, desperate to take the vital crossroads before Patton could arrive, launched wave after wave of attacks. The fighting was brutal, often hand-to-hand in the snow-filled woods. Every house, every ditch, was a fortress. The paratroopers used their limited ammunition sparingly, making every shot count. They fought with a cold, desperate courage, born from knowing there was no retreat. They could hear the distant rumble of artillery, a sound that could mean either destruction or salvation. They prayed it was the latter. They had faith in 2 things: each other, and the promise that Patton was coming. It was a promise that seemed more like a fantasy as the days bled into one another. Leading the charge for Patton's Third Army was the 4th Armored Division. Their mission was simple, but incredibly dangerous. Punch a hole through the German ring and reach the 101st. They were the tip of the spear. The Germans knew they were coming, and had set up formidable defenses. Anti-tank guns were hidden in the woods, and panzer divisions were shifted to block the advance. The final few miles to Bastogne became a brutal gauntlet. American tanks were knocked out, and casualties mounted, but they refused to stop. They clawed their way forward, village by village, field by frozen field. The lead element was Combat Command R, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would later become one of America's most famous tank commanders. His Sherman tanks were the battering ram aimed at the heart of the German encirclement. And then it happened. At 1650 hours, just as the winter sun was beginning to set on December 26th, the tankers of the 37th Tank Battalion saw something through the gloom. Figures in American uniforms, waving. It was a patrol from the 101st. The lead Sherman tank, named Cobra King, smashed through the final German roadblock. It rumbled into the American perimeter, its engine a song of salvation. The siege was broken. The impossible promise had been kept. Patton had done what no one thought possible. He had turned his army around and driven it over 100 miles through ice and enemy resistance in just 3 days. For the soldiers of the 101st, seeing those tanks roll in wasn't just a relief. It was a resurrection. They climbed out of their foxholes, gaunt and weary, but with grins spreading across their frostbitten faces. They swarmed the tanks, shaking hands with the crews, sharing their last cigarettes. The tankers, in turn, shared their rations. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy and brotherhood, forged in the crucible of war. The breakthrough at Bastogne was a critical turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. It stabilized the southern shoulder of the German salient and ensured that the vital crossroads would remain in Allied hands, while the battle would rage for another month. The failure to capture Bastogne spelled the beginning of the end for Hitler's last great gamble in the West. It was a testament to two kinds of courage: the stubborn, unyielding courage of the besieged, and the aggressive, relentless courage of the rescuers. The battered bastards of Bastogne became legends, symbols of American tenacity, and Patton, love him or hate him, had cemented his reputation as a commander who could achieve the impossible. He had promised a Christmas delivery, and though he was a day late, no one in the 101st was complaining. They had received the greatest gift of all: another chance to fight and another chance to live. This incredible story is just one of many that define the courage and sacrifice of that generation. It has a powerful reminder of what can be accomplished against overwhelming odds through sheer determination and unwavering resolve. Thank you for watching. December 27th, 1944. A new chapter in the Battle of the Bulge begins. The brutal siege of Bastogne is broken. The exhausted, frostbitten paratroopers of the 101st Airborne finally see the friendly steel of Patton as 4th Armored Division rolling into their shattered town. 4 days, they had held out against impossible odds, famously telling the Germans nuts when asked to surrender. Now, the tide was about to turn, not just at Bastogne, but across the entire Ardennes front. The relief of Bastogne wasn't an end. It was the starting pistol for a furious counterattack. General George S. Patton, never one to let an opportunity slip, didn't just relieve the town, he used it as a pivot point. His Third Army, having just completed one of the most remarkable strategic redeployments in military history, immediately went on the offensive. They didn't just plug a hole, they began to hammer the southern flank of the German Bulge, the bulge that gave the battle its name. The German plan had relied on speed and surprise. They needed to punch through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize the port of Antwerp before the Allies could react. They had achieved surprise, but they hadn't counted on the tenacity of the American soldier, and they certainly hadn't counted on the weather clearing. For the first week of the offensive, a thick, soupy fog and low-lying clouds had grounded the most powerful air force in the world. Allied fighter bombers and heavy bombers sat idle on airfields across England and France, their pilots anxiously scanning the skies. But as 1944 drew to a close, a Christmas miracle of a different kind occurred. The skies cleared. A cold, crisp winter sun appeared, and with it, the full might of Allied air power was unleashed. It was a beautiful and terrifying sight. Swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and British Typhoons descended upon the Ardennes. Te weret, te jabots, the jagged bomber, as the German soldiers called them. They were relentless. They strafed German columns, which were now stuck bumper to bumper on the narrow, icy roads. They hunted panzers with rockets and bombs, turning the pride of the Wehrmacht into burning hulks. The vital supply lines that were meant to fuel the German spearhead were systematically shredded from the air. A German soldier later wrote that the open roads became a jabot racecourse, where they were the terrified contestants. Ontegrun Patton's men were just as ferocious. The fighting was a brutal, grinding affair in the snow-covered forests and hills. The Germans, particularly the elite SS Panzer divisions, fought with a desperate ferocity. They knew this was their last great gamble in the West. If they failed here, the war was lost. But Patton's Third Army was a well-oiled machine, hardened by months of combat since Normandy. They were veterans, and they were angry. The German salient, once a terrifying armored spearhead, was now becoming a trap. On the southern shoulder, Patton's forces pushed relentlessly north and east. In the north, the U.S. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, and the British, the 30th Corps, under Field Marshal Montgomery, began to squeeze from the other side. The German commanders on the ground saw the writing on the wall. Their spearheads were literally running out of gas. Tanks, the fearsome tigers and panthers, were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because their fuel tanks were empty. The logistical nightmare for the Germans was absolute. The supplies they so desperately needed were either being blown up by fighter bombers or were stuck miles behind the front lines on congested, frozen roads. Soldiers were running out of food and ammunition. Frostbite was as much an enemy as the American infantry. Morale, once sky-high from the initial successes, began to plummet. The dream of a swift victory had frozen solid in the Ardennes snow. Back in his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler refused to see reality. He ordered his generals to hold their ground, to press the attack, even as their divisions were being bled white. He saw any retreat as a sign of weakness, a betrayal of the National Socialist will. But will alone cannot fuel a tank or feed a soldier. His commanders on the front pleaded for permission to pull back, to consolidate their forces, to save what was left of their armies. For a time, Hitler refused. He was living in a fantasy world, detached from the horrific reality his soldiers were facing. By the first days of January 1945, the situation for the German forces was untenable. The once mighty Wehrmacht was in a full-blown, blood-soaked retreat. They were fighting a desperate rearguard action, trying to escape the closing pincers of the Allied armies. The roads were littered with the debris of a defeated army. Abandoned tanks, wrecked trucks, frozen bodies. What began as a grand, audacious gamble to split the Allies and force a negotiated peace had ended in a catastrophic failure. The Battle of the Bulge was not over yet. Weeks of bitter fighting still lay ahead to erase the salient completely. But the strategic initiative had been lost for Germany, forever. They had thrown their last reserves, their best remaining soldiers and equipment, into one final roll of the dice, and had come up empty. The counteroffensive had not just stopped the German attack. It had broken its back. The path to the Rhine, and to the heart of Germany itself, was now open. The end of the war in Europe was finally, truly, in sight. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the final months of World War II in Europe. Today, we're covering the dramatic collapse of the German offensive in the Ardennes, a period from January 8th to January 16th, 1945. This is the moment the infamous Bulge finally bursts. As we step into January 1945, the situation for the German forces in the Ardennes is dire. Their ambitious plan, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, has completely unraveled. The initial shock and awe of their surprise attack in mid-December has given way to a brutal, grinding battle of attrition. The skies, once gray and protective, have cleared, allowing Allied air power to wreak havoc on German supply lines and armored columns. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs are masters of the sky, hunting anything that moves on the snow-covered roads below. On Tagron, the German spearheads are blunted, out of fuel, and facing increasingly stiff and coordinated Allied resistance. The heroic defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne had already stalled the German advance. Now, the pincers are closing in. From the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army, after its incredible race to relieve Bastogne, is relentlessly pushing north, squeezing the southern flank of the salient. Patton is a man possessed, driving his men forward with an iron will, determined to trap and annihilate the German armies. He sees this not just as a defensive victory, but as an opportunity for a decisive, war-ending encirclement. Simultaneously, from the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's forces, including the U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges, are grinding their way south. The progress is slow, hampered by a combination of exhausted troops, a desperate German rearguard, and some of the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades. The snow is deep, the temperatures are sub, and the terrain of the Ardennes dense forests, steep hills, and narrow, winding roads is a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. Every village, every crossroads, becomes a small, vicious battle. By January 8th, the writing is on the wall. The two Allied fronts are just miles apart. For the German soldiers caught in the middle, the dream of reaching Antwerp is a distant, cruel memory. The reality is a desperate struggle for survival. They are caught in a shrinking pocket, a Kessel as they would call it. The German High Command, finally facing the inevitable, authorizes a phased withdrawal. But it's too little, too late. The retreat is a nightmare. Imagine the scene. Thousands of German soldiers, many of them just boys or old men scraped from the bottom of the barrel, are trudging eastward. They are on foot, their tanks and trucks abandoned for lack of fuel or destroyed by air attacks. They move through a landscape of utter devastation. The Ardennes Forest, so beautiful and serene just weeks before, is now a graveyard of steel. The roads are littered with the smoking carcasses of Panther and Tiger tanks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. The snow is stained with oil and blood, churned into a muddy, frozen slush by the tracks of countless vehicles. These aren't the confident, swaggering soldiers of 1940. These are broken men, hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, their faces gaunt from hunger and blackened by frostbite. They fight stubborn rearguard actions, using the terrain to their advantage, trying to hold off the American pursuit long enough for their comrades to escape. They are still a dangerous foe, but they are fighting a battle they know is lost. Every hour, the Allied pincers draw closer. The link-up of the Allied armies is the final nail in the coffin. On January 16, 1945, near the town of Hafulais, patrols from the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies finally meet. The Bulge is officially sealed. The great German salient, which once stretched nearly 50 miles deep into the Allied lines, has been completely eliminated. The German survivors who managed to escape the trap limp back across the border, having left behind a staggering amount of men and materiel. The cost of this operation, WWII, was catastrophic for the German army. They lost hundreds of tanks and assault guns, and over 1,000 aircraft. More importantly, they suffered irreplaceable losses in manpower, including many of their last remaining veteran panzer divisions. These were elite troops that Germany could not afford to lose. The offensive had not only failed to achieve its objectives, but it had also exhausted Germany's last strategic reserves in the West, paving the way for the final Allied push into the heart of the Reich. For the Allies, it was a monumental victory, a testament to the resilient courage and logistical might of their forces. It was a victory forged in the frozen forests by soldiers who refused to break. But this victory came at a terrible price. The Battle of the Bulge was the single bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. Over the course of the 6-week campaign, American forces suffered over 75,000 casualties, with around 19,000 killed. Thousands more suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and combat exhaustion. Every one of those numbers represents a personal story of sacrifice. For the men who fought there, the Ardennes was an icy hell. It was a place of constant fear, of numbing cold, and of watching friends fall. For General Patton, the battle was a vindication of his aggressive, hard-charging style of leadership. He had achieved his objective, relieved Bastogne, and played a crucial role in collapsing the German offensive. He saw it as a decisive triumph. Yet, even in victory, the immense cost in human life was a sobering reality. The battle had been won, but the forest was silent, holding the secrets of the thousands who would never go home. The road to Berlin was now open, but it was a road paved with the sacrifices made in the snows of the Ardennes. January 20th, 1945. Picture this. A man stands on a ridge, the biting Belgian winter wind whipping at his uniform. Below him, a landscape of frozen fields, scarred by the recent fury of battle. This man is General George S. Patton. The Battle of the Bulge, one of the most brutal conflicts of World War II, is drawing to a close, and his audacious, seemingly impossible gambit has turned the tide. For most, this would be a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. A time to breathe, to celebrate. But for Patton, it was something else entirely. He was triumphant, yes, but he was also deeply, profoundly restless. Victory, for George Patton, was a fleeting concept. It wasn't the destination. It was merely a signpost on a much longer, faster road. What mattered to him was momentum, the relentless, forward-driving force of an army that never stops, that never gives the enemy a moment's peace. Pace. To stop was to stagnate. To hesitate was to invite defeat. This philosophy was the very core of his being. the engine that drove him through the mud and chaos of war. That night, under a cold, indifferent moon, he confided in his most trusted companion, his diary. He wrote a line that perfectly captures his spirit. "It is in the coldest hell that men discover their fire." What a powerful statement. It speaks of forging strength from hardship, of finding one's inner furnace in the absolute worst of conditions. And Patton had just led his men through that coldest hell. Let's rewind a bit to understand the magnitude of what just happened. December 1944. The Allied advance across Europe had stalled. Many thought the German war machine was broken on its last legs. Then, in a final, desperate gamble, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the dense Ardennes Forest. It was a blitzkrieg, a lightning war that caught the Allies completely off guard. The German forces punched a huge bulge in the American lines, surrounding the 101st Airborne Division in the key town of Bastogne. The situation was dire. Allied High Command was in a state of controlled panic. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, held a crisis meeting with his top generals. When he asked how long it would take to mount a counterattack, the estimates were grim. Days, maybe a week, to disengage troops from their current positions, turn them, and march them north through the brutal winter weather. But then, one voice cut through the tension. It was Patton. He declared, with his typical bravado, that he could have his Third Army on the move and attacking within 48 hours. The other generals in the room were stunned. Some probably thought he was insane. Patton's Third Army was engaged in its own offensive, nearly 100 miles to the south. To disengage from that fight, pivot his entire force, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and trucks, and then force march them north through ice and snow was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. It seemed impossible. But Patton had been anticipating this. He was a master student of war, and he had a gut feeling that something like this might happen. His staff had already been drawing up contingency plans, just in case. This wasn't just audacity. It was audacious preparation, and he delivered. In one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in history, Patton's Third Army turned on a dime. The Red Bull Express, the famous supply convoy, was rerouted. Tanks and troops began the grueling trek north. The soldiers faced blizzards, frozen roads, and constant mechanical breakdowns. It was a brutal, bone-chilling march. Yet they pressed on, fueled by the sheer force of their commander's will. On December 26th, the lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines and relieved the battered defenders of Bastogne. The siege was broken. Patton's charge hadn't just saved the 101st Airborne. It had shattered the momentum of the German offensive and sealed its fate. So now we return to that ridge in Belgium. Patton is looking out over the fields where his men fought and bled. His audacity had, without question, changed the course of the war. He had stared into the abyss of a potential Allied disaster and spit in its eye. AID, proven once again that he was a warrior of unparalleled genius, a commander who could achieve the impossible. It was a hero celebrated in newspapers back home, a living legend among his troops, the man who got things done. But here's the paradox of Patton. The very same qualities that made him a brilliant battlefield commander also made him a massive liability in the eyes of his superiors. Like Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley, his audacity was a double-edged sword. On the battlefield, it was a weapon of incredible power. In the political arena of high command, it was a source of constant anxiety. They were terrified of him. Why? Because Patton was uncontrollable. He was a force of nature. He spoke his mind, often in the most undiplomatic and offensive ways. He had a flair for the dramatic, a love for the spotlight, and a belief in his own destiny that bordered on mystical. Think about the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily, where he struck 2 soldiers suffering from battle fatigue. That incident almost ended his career. It revealed a man who struggled to comprehend any weakness, physical or psychological. A man whose own internal fire burned so hot he couldn't understand why others might falter. His superiors saw a loose cannon, a man who could create a diplomatic incident or a public relations nightmare at any moment. They needed Patton to win battles, but they feared what he might do or say in the process. He was too aggressive, too eager to push forward, too willing to risk everything for a decisive victory. While other generals were focused on the careful, methodical, broad front strategy preferred by Eisenhower, Patton was a proponent of the single, deep thrust. He wanted to unleash his armored divisions and drive straight for the heart of Germany, not stopping until they reached Berlin. He believed that this was the fastest way to end the war and save lives in the long run. He chafed under the restraints placed upon him, seeing them as timid and short. He believed his superiors were playing chess while he was fighting a war. This constant friction defined his relationship with the high command. So, as he stood on that ridge, Patton's mind was likely a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. There was the pride of victory, the satisfaction of proving his critics wrong, but beneath it all, there was a gnawing restlessness, a frustration. The war wasn't over. The enemy was wounded but not dead, and he knew, with a bitter certainty, that he would be held back again. His superiors would prioritize caution over speed, politics over pure military logic. He was a thoroughbred racehorse being forced to pull a plow. Patton was a man born for a single purpose: to wage war. In peacetime, his personality was abrasive and difficult, but in the crucible of combat, he was a master. He understood the psychology of the soldier, the rhythm of battle, and the critical importance of speed and aggression. His men, for the most part, loved him. They called him old blood and guts, not because he was careless with their lives, but because he was willing to share their hardships and lead from the front. They knew that when Patton was in command, they were going to move, they were going to fight, and they were going to win. In the end, the story of George S. Patton is a tragedy wrapped in triumph. He was the indispensable man who was also the expendable one. A hero who was also a liability. A military genius whose own personality was his greatest enemy. As the war in Europe ground to its inevitable conclusion, Patton would find himself increasingly sidelined, his calls to push on and confront the new Soviet threat ignored. The fire that he discovered in the coldest hell of the Ardennes would continue to burn, but it would be a fire with nowhere to go. It was the internal conflict of a man who had won the war, but in doing so, had made himself obsolete. This moment, on a cold Belgian ridge, captures the essence of the man, a victor who could never be satisfied, a hero who was feared by his own side, a warrior forever chasing the horizon of the next battle. By January 25th, 1945, a cold, hard silence began to fall over the Ardennes Forest. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, was officially over. The snow-covered landscape, once torn apart by the roar of tanks and the crack of artillery, was now a vast, frozen graveyard for the ambitions of the Third Reich. Hitler had thrown everything he had left into this one monumental offensive. The elite panzer divisions, the fanatical SS troops, the last reserves of fuel and ammunition all were hurled against the Allied lines in a bid to split their forces and drive them back to the sea. For a few terrifying weeks in December, it seemed like the unthinkable might happen. German spearheads punched deep into American lines, creating the infamous bulge in the front. The weather was atrocious, grounding the Allies. Powerful air force. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of desperate, heroic resistance, where surrounded American soldiers famously replied nuts to a German surrender demand. The situation was dire. The Allied command was reeling, caught completely by surprise. The war, which had seemed so close to its end, suddenly felt uncertain again. In this moment of crisis, one man saw not just a threat, but an opportunity. From his headquarters in the south, General George S. Patton Jr. was already thinking moves ahead, while others scrambled to contain the German advance. Patton was planning a counterattack of breathtaking audacity. He famously told his staff, "Their krauts have stuck their head in a meat grinder," and he intended to be the one to turn the handle. On December 19th, at a high-level meeting in while other commanders were pessimistic, Patton made an astonishing promise. He declared he could disengage his Third Army, which was facing a different direction and preparing for its own offensive, turn it 90 degrees, and march it over 100 miles north to relieve the besieged forces at Bastogne. And he could do it in 48 hours. The other generals were stunned. It was an impossible logistical feat, moving 3 entire divisions over 60,000 men and their equipment in the dead of winter, over icy, congested roads, was considered a fantasy, but for Patton, logistics were just another problem to be solved with sheer willpower. He had been preparing for this moment. His staff had already drawn up 3 separate contingency plans for just such a scenario. He wasn't guessing. He was The order was given, and one of the most remarkable marches in military history began. The Red Bull Express, the legendary supply convoy system, went into overdrive. Engineers worked around the clock to keep the roads open, battling ice and snow. The men of the Third Army marched relentlessly, day and night, in freezing temperatures. Trucks skidded off roads, engines froze, but they kept moving. Patton was everywhere, a whirlwind of energy, driving his men forward. He rode in his jeep, stood on the side of roads, directing traffic, cursing, cajoling, and inspiring everyone from generals to privates. He understood the psychology of his soldiers. He knew they were tired, cold, and scared. But he also knew they were capable of greatness if they were led with absolute confidence. And on December 26th, just after Christmas, the lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed through the German lines and linked up with the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The siege was broken. It was a moment that electrified the Allied world. Patton had done the impossible. He had turned an army on a dime and relieved a critical strongpoint in record time. But this was just the beginning of his symphony. Relieving Bastogne was one thing. Destroying the German armies in the Bulge was another. The fighting that followed in January was brutal. A slow, grinding battle of attrition in the harshest winter conditions Europe had seen in years. Patton's forces, now attacking the southern flank of the Bulge, relentlessly pushed north. The Germans, trapped in a shrinking pocket with their supply lines cut and fuel running out, fought with the desperation of cornered animals. The forests of the Ardennes became a hellscape of close-quarters combat. Tanks dueled in snow-choked clearings, and infantrymen battled for every frozen hill and village. Through it all, Patton's drive was relentless. His famous motto, il est audacious, toujours, il est audacious, audacity, audacity, always audacity, was on full display. He pushed his commanders, demanding constant pressure, never letting the enemy rest, never giving them a chance to regroup. He understood that speed was his greatest weapon. By moving faster than the enemy could react, he kept them perpetually off balance. His grasp of armored warfare was intuitive, almost artistic. He saw the battlefield not as a static line, but as a fluid space of maneuver and opportunity. As January wore on, the German Bulge collapsed. Thousands of soldiers were captured, and vast quantities of irreplaceable equipment were abandoned. The elite panzer divisions that had been the terror of Europe were shattered, their strength broken forever. Hitler's offensive had not only failed to achieve its objectives, it had catastrophically weakened the German army on the Western Front, consuming the last of its strategic reserves. The gamble had failed, and the price was the Reich itself. By the time the battle officially ended on January 25th, the strategic picture of the war had been fundamentally transformed. The Western Front was stabilized, and the path into Germany, the road to Berlin, was now wide open. The Battle of the Bulge was a testament to the resilience of the American soldier, who held the line against overwhelming odds. But the counterstroke, the decisive blow that turned a defensive crisis into an offensive victory, was Patton's masterpiece. It was more than just tactics and logistics. It was a performance fueled by an indomitable will. Patton was a complex, controversial figure. He was profane, arrogant, and deeply spiritual. He believed in reincarnation and felt he had been a warrior in past lives. But in that frozen winter, his singular focus and unshakable self-belief were exactly what the Allies needed. He was the right man, in the right place, at the right time. As the snows of January 1945 covered the wreckage in the Ardennes, the echoes of Patton's tank engines faded, but their impact would reverberate through history. He had proven his own famous words: "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." And in that brutal, decisive winter, no man moved faster, farther, or with more history-altering purpose than General George S. Patton Jr. The winter that was meant to save the Reich had instead broken it, thanks in large part to the audacity of one American general.